Religion in ancient India. Like Indian politics and society, Indian religion is a blend of Aryan and Dravidian culture. The intermingling of those two civilizations gave rise to an extraordinarily complex set of religious beliefs and practices, filled with diversity and contrast. Out of this cultural mix came two of the most largest and world's greatest religions, that of Buddhism and Hinduism, and several smaller ones including Jainism and Sikhism. Early Aryan religious beliefs, however, are known to historians as Brahmanism. In time, Brahmanical beliefs and practices would give rise to Hinduism, as will be discussed later. Here we will focus on the earliest religious traditions and on the origins of Buddhism. Brahmanism. Again, Brahmanism was the precursor to what is known as Hinduism. Evidence about the earliest religious beliefs of the Aryan peoples comes primarily from sacred texts such as the Vedas, 4 collections of hymns and religious ceremonies transmitted by memory through the centuries by Aryan priests. Many of these religious ideas were probably common to all of the Indo-European peoples before their separation into different groups at least 4,000 years ago. Early Aryan beliefs were based on the common concept of a pantheon of gods and goddesses representing great forces of nature, similar to the immortals of Greek mythology. The Aryan ancestor of the Greek father god Zeus, for example, may have been the deity known in early Aryan tradition as Dyaus. The parent god Dyaus was a somewhat distant figure, however, who was eventually overshadowed by other more functional gods possessing more familiar human traits. For a while, the primary Aryan god was the great warrior god Indra. Indra summoned the Aryan tribal peoples to war and was represented in nature by thunder. Later, Indra declined in importance and was replaced by Varuna, lord of justice. Other gods and goddesses represented various forces of nature or the needs of human beings, such as fire, fertility, and wealth. The concept of sacrifice was a key element in Aryan religious belief. In Vedic times, as in many other ancient cultures, the practice may have begun as human sacrifice, but later animals were used as substitutes. The priestly class, the Brahmins, played a key role in these ceremonies. Another element of Indian religious belief in ancient times was the ideal of asceticism. Although there is no reference to such practices in the Vedas, by the 6th century BCE, self-discipline or subjecting oneself to painful stimuli. Yes?
Do you have the appendixes?
Oh, I sent the office.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all
I went ahead and sent it.
No, it's okay.
Sorry. Yes. So self-discipline or subjecting oneself to painful stimuli had begun to replace sacrifice as a means of placating or communicating with the gods. Apparently, the original motive for asceticism was to achieve magical powers. But later, in the Upanishads, a set of commentaries on the Vedas, compiled in the 6th century BCE, it was seen as a means of spiritual meditation that would enable the practitioner to reach beyond material reality to a world of truth and bliss beyond earthly joy and sorrow, indeed, extremely metaphysical, and one might say, also idealistic in an absolute sense. So it is possible that another motive was to permit those with strong religious convictions to communicate directly with metaphysical reality without having to rely on the priestly class at court. Asceticism, of course, has been practiced in other religions, including Christianity and Islam, but it seems particularly identified with Hinduism, the religion that emerged from the early Indian religious tradition. Eventually, asceticism evolved into the modern practice of body training that we know as yoga, also known as union, which is accepted today as a meaningful element of Hindu religious practice. Reincarnation. Another new concept that probably began to appear around the time the Upanishads were written was reincarnation. Again, the Upanishads was a set of commentaries on the Vedas compiled in the 6th century. The idea of reincarnation, that the individual soul is reborn in a different form after death and progresses through several existences on the wheel of life until it reaches its final destination in a union with the great world soul, Brahman. Of course, because life is harsh, this final release is the objective of all living souls. From this concept comes the term Brahmanism, referring to the early Aryan religious tradition. A key element in this process is the idea of karma, that one's rebirth in a next life is determined by one's actions, or karma, in this life. Hinduism, as it emerged from Brahmanism, placed all living species on a vast scale of existence, including the four classes and the untouchables in human society. The current status of an individual soul, then, is not simply a cosmic accident, but the inevitable result of actions that soul has committed in its past existence. At the top of the scale are the Brahmins, who by definition are closest to ultimate release from the law of reincarnation. The Brahmins are followed in descending order by the other classes in human society and the world of the beasts. Within the animal kingdom, an especially high position is reversed for the cow, which even today is revered by Hindus as a sacred beast. Some scholars have speculated that the unique role played by the cow in Hinduism derives from the value of cattle in Aryan pastoral society, but others have pointed out that cattle were a source of both money and food, and suggest that the cow's sacred position may have descended from the concept of the sacred bull in Harappan culture. The concept of karma is governed by the dharma, or the law, and so the concept of one's actions is governed by the law. A law regulating human behavior, the dharma, imposes different requirements on different individuals depending on their status in society. Those high on the social scale, such as Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, or the warrior class, are held to a stricter form of behavior than Sudras. The Brahmin, for example, is expected to abstain from eating meat because that would entail the killing of another living being, thus interrupting its karma, or its actions. How the concept of reincarnation originated is not known, although it was apparently not unusual for early peoples to believe that the individual soul would be reborn in a different form in a later life. Just think about the Egyptians, for example. In any case, in India, the concept may have had practical causes as well as consequences. In the first place, it tended to provide religious sanction for the rigid class divisions that had begun to emerge in Indian society after the arrival of the Aryans, and it provided moral and political justification for the privileges of those on the higher end of the scale. At the same time, the concept of reincarnation provided certain compensations for those lower on the ladder of life. For example, it gave hope to the poor that if they behaved properly in this life, they might improve their condition in the next. It also provided a means for unassimilated groups such as ethnic minorities to find a place in Indian society among the hierarchy, while at the same time permitting them to maintain their distinctive way of life. The ultimate goal of achieving good, or karma, as we have seen, was to escape the cycle of existence. To the sophisticated, the nature of that release was a spiritual union of the individual soul with the great world soul, or Brahman, described in the Upanishads as a form of dreamless sleep, free from earthly desires. And then there was popular religion, but little is known about the religious beliefs of the vast majority of the Indian people during this formative stage in South Asian society. In all likelihood, popular religion during the first millennium BCE was a distant reflection of its counterpart in India today, which is peopled with a multitude of very human gods and goddesses. It has been estimated that the Hindu pantheon contains more than 33,000 deities. Only a small number are primary deities, however, notably the so-called Trinity of gods, Brahman the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva, originally the Vedic god Rudra the destroyer. So we have Brahman the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer. Although Brahman, sometimes in his concrete form called Brahma, is considered to be the highest god, Vishnu and Shiva take precedence in the devotional exercises of many Hindus, who can be roughly divided into Vishnuites and Shaivites. In addition to the Trinity of gods, all of whom have wives with readily identifiable roles and personalities, there are countless minor deities, each again with his or her own specific function. A notable example is Ganesha, described in Indian literature as a son of Shiva who was accidentally beheaded by his father in a fit of anger. When Shiva repented of his action, he provided his son with the head of an elephant. Even today, the widely reversed Ganesha is often viewed as the god of good fortune. The rich variety and the earthly character of many of these deities are somewhat misleading, for Hindus regarded the multitude of gods simply as different manifestations of one ultimate reality. The various deities also provide a way for ordinary Indians to personify their religious feelings, even though some individuals among the early Aryans attempted to communicate with the gods through animal sacrifice or asceticism. Most Indians undoubtedly sought to classify their own individual religious needs through devotion, which they expressed through ritual ceremonies and offerings at a temple. Such offerings were not only a way of seeking salvation, but also a means of satisfying all the aspirations of daily life. Over the centuries, Indian religious belief changed radically from its origins in Aryan pastoral society. An early belief in deities, or gods and goddesses representing forces of nature, gradually gave way to a more elitist system with a priestly class at court performing sacrifices in order to obtain heavenly favors. During the first millennium BCE, religious belief began to evolve into a more personal experience, with an emphasis on ethics as a means of obtaining a union between the individual soul, Atman, and the ultimate reality, Brahman. So they would have a hymn to the Atman, or Atman. Such a concept, however, was probably too ethereal for the average Indian who looked for a more concrete form of heavenly salvation, a place of beauty and bliss after a life of disease and privation. In latter centuries, the Brahmanical beliefs and practices of early Aryan society would gradually be replaced by a more popular faith that would henceforth become known as Hinduism. We will discuss that transformation later on. Buddhism and the Middle Path. In the 6th century BCE, a new doctrine appeared in northern India that would eventually begin to rival the popularity of Brahmanical beliefs throughout the subcontinent. This new doctrine was called Buddhism. The life of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, or Siddhartha Gautama, 560 to 480 BCE, was a native of a small kingdom in the foothills of the Himalaya Mountains in what is today southern Nepal. He was born in the mid-6th century BCE, the son of a ruling warrior class family. According to tradition, the young Siddhartha was raised in an affluent surrounding and trained, like many other members of his warrior class, in the martial arts. On reaching maturity, he had married and began to raise a family. At the age of 29, however, he suddenly discovered the pain of illness, the sorrow of death, and the degradation caused by old age in the lives of ordinary people, and exclaimed, "Would that sickness, age, and death might be forever bound?" From that time on, he decided to dedicate his life to determining the cause and seeking the cure for human suffering. To find the answers to these questions, Siddhartha abandoned his home and family and traveled widely. At first, he tried to follow the model of the ascetics, but he eventually decided that self-mortification did not lead to a greater understanding of life and abandoned the practice. Then one day, after a lengthy period of meditation under a tree, he achieved enlightenment as to the meaning of life and spent the remaining time of his life preaching it or proclaiming it. His conclusions, as embodied in his teachings, became the philosophy, or some would have it, the religion of Buddhism. Of course, we need to think that this kind of Eastern religion is not the same as that of the Western idea or sense of religion, and according to legend, the devil, or the Indian term is Mara, attempted desperately to tempt him with political power and the company of beautiful girls. But obviously both believe in spirits and gods and things of that nature, in some sense of the word. But Siddhartha Gautama resisted. Buddhism and Brahmanism. How much the modern doctrine of Buddhism resembles the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama is open to debate among historians, for much time has elapsed since his death, and original texts relating to his ideas are extremely lacking. Nor is it certain that Siddhartha even intended to found a new religion or a doctrine. In some respects, his ideas could be viewed as a reformist form of Brahmanism, designed to transfer responsibility from the priests to the individual, much as the 16th century German monk Martin Luther saw his ideas as a reformation of Christianity. Siddhartha accepted much of the belief system of Brahmanism, if not all of its practices. For example, he accepted the concept of reincarnation and that the role of karma as a means of influencing the movement of individual souls up and down the scale and hierarchy of life. He praised nonviolence and borrowed the idea of living a life of simplicity and chastity from the ascetics. Moreover, his vision of metaphysical reality, commonly known as nirvana, is closer to the Aryan concept of Brahman than it is to the Christian concept of heavenly salvation. Nirvana, which involves an extinction of selfhood and a final reunion with the great world soul, is sometimes likened to a dreamless sleep or to a kind of blowing out, as of a candle. Buddhists occasionally remark that someone who asks for a description does not understand the concept. At the same time, the new doctrine differed from existing practices in a number of key ways. In the first place, Siddhartha denied the existence of an individual soul. To him, the concept of Atman, the individual soul, meant that the soul was subject to rebirth and thus did not achieve a complete liberation from the cares of this world. In fact, Siddhartha denied the ultimate reality of the material world in its entirety and taught that it was an illusion that had to be transcended. Siddhartha's idea of achieving nirvana was based on his conviction that the pain, poverty, and sorrow that afflict human beings are caused essentially by their attachment to the things of this world. And again, it's the vision of metaphysical reality, and it involves an extinction of selfhood and a final reunion with the great world soul, linked to a great dreamless sleep or a kind of blowing out as if like a candle. And once worldly cares are abandoned, pain and sorrow can be overcome. With this knowledge comes Bodhi, or wisdom, source of the term Buddhism, and the familiar name of Gautama, the wise Gautama Buddha. Achieving this understanding is a key step on the road to nirvana, which is, as in Brahmanism, a form of release from the wheel of life. According to tradition, Siddhartha transmitted this message in a sermon to his disciples in a deer park on Sarnath, not far from the modern city of Varanasi. Like so many messages, it is deceptively simple and is enclosed in four noble truths. Life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. The way to end suffering is to end desire, and the way to end desire is to avoid the extremes of a life of vulgar materialism and a life of self-torture, and to follow what is called the middle path. Also known as the Eightfold Way, the middle path calls for right knowledge, right purpose, right speech, right conduct, right occupation, right effort, right awareness, and right meditation. And so this religion is more like a philosophy than an actual religion, because it believes in more philosophical ideas than actual religious deities. Another characteristic of Buddhism was its relative egalitarianism. Although Siddhartha accepted the idea of reincarnation and other supernatural and superstitious things, and hence the idea that human beings differed as a result of karma accumulated in a previous existence, he rejected the division of humanity into rigidly defined classes based on previous reincarnations, and taught that all human beings could aspire to nirvana as a result of their behavior in this life, a message that likely helped Buddhism win support among people at the lower end of the social scale and social hierarchy. In addition, Buddhism was much simpler than existing beliefs. Siddhartha rejected the panoply of gods that had become identified with Brahmanism and forbade his followers to worship his person or his image after his death. In fact, many Buddhists view Buddhism as a philosophy, again, rather than a religion. After Siddhartha Gautama's death in 480 BCE, dedicated disciples carried his message the length and breadth of India. Buddhist monasteries were established throughout the subcontinent, and temples and stupas, or stone towers housing relics of the Buddha, sprang up throughout the entire countryside. Women were permitted to join the monastic order, but only in an inferior position. As Siddhartha had explained, women are soon angered, full of passion, and stupid. That is the reason why women have no place in public assemblies, he said, and do not earn their living by any profession. Still, the profession and position of women tended to be better in Buddhist societies than it was elsewhere in ancient India. During the next centuries, Buddhism began to compete actively with the existing Aryan beliefs, as well as with another new faith known as Jainism, or Jainism. Jainism was founded by Mahavira, a contemporary of Siddhartha Gautama. Resembling Buddhism in its rejection of the reality of the material world, Zionism, or Jainism was more extreme in practice, where Siddhartha Gautama called for the middle way between passion and luxury on one extreme and pain and self-torture on the other. Mahavira preached a doctrine of extreme simplicity to his followers, who kept no possessions and relied on begging for a living. Some even rejected clothing and wandered through the world naked. Perhaps because of its insistence on a life of poverty, Jainism failed to attract enough adherents to become a major doctrine and never received official support. According to tradition, however, Chandragupta Maurya accepted Mahavira's doctrine after abdicating the throne and fasted to death in a Jain monastery. Asoka, a Buddhist monarch. Buddhism received an important boost when Asoka, the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, converted to Buddhism in the 3rd century BCE. Asoka, 269 to 232 BCE, is widely considered the greatest ruler in the history of India. By his own admission, as noted in rock edicts placed around his kingdom, Asoka began his reign conquering, pillaging, and killing, but after his conversion to Buddhism, he began to regret his bloodthirsty past and attempted to rule benevolently. Asoka directed that banyan trees and shelters be placed along the road to provide shade and rest for weary travelers. He sent Buddhist missionaries throughout India and ordered the erection of stone pillars with official edicts and Buddhist inscriptions to instruct the people in the proper way. According to tradition, his son converted the island of Sri Lanka to Buddhism, and the peoples there accepted a tributary relationship with the Mauryan Empire. And again, in India, you have Bactria to the north. At the Indus River, you have towards the Ganges, above the Ganges to the north east. You have the Himalayas. Further down to the south west, you have Gujarat. In the middle, the Deccan Plateau. Near the Godavari River. Towards the end part of the peninsula, you have the Malabar coast. To the north of the Malabar coast, you have the Arabian Sea. And of course, to the south part of the tip near Sri Lanka, you have the Indian Ocean. And then, of course, towards the eastern part of India, you have the Bay of Bengal. And Asoka, the greatest Indian monarch that ruled over much of the subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE, his empire was extremely extensive, and one can still see today the pillars, edicts that were erected along major trade routes.